All right, coming up next, we've got just a brilliant guy. Look this guy up. I mean, it was Valdai Club, you name it. His name is on the lips of all the important people in the world. Dr. Nicolai Petro. He's a professor of comparative and international politics. He's an author and actually a good friend. And he joins us now. Dr. Petro, welcome to the Mother of All Talk Shows.
I don't know if I can ever live up to an introduction like that. I'm sure I can't. Thank you.
Yes,
hopefully
and your latest
part.
Oh, definitely there. So let's talk about, well, in fact, your latest book. Tell them, just remind everyone what your latest book, The Tragedy of Ukraine.
Right. The Tragedy of Ukraine, how classical Greek tragedy helps with conflict resolution. And I thought it was important to think about the events in Ukraine in a longer historical context, and then ask, well, how have these sorts of really serious, long-term, multi-generational conflicts been resolved in the past? And it turns out, from what I found, the Greeks had a good way of teaching people to get beyond their hatred of each other, and the vehicle that they used for that was classical Greek tragedy. So I kind of wove it all together. I talk a lot about the events in Ukraine, what has led up to this conflict, and tried in this book, now 2 years old, to indicate how it's likely to be resolved.
You know, that's a perfect segue into our discussion, because one of the issues that's clearly of great note in this is the cultivation of hate, the cultivation of the ultranationalists, the extreme anti-Russian hate amongst the ultranationalists in Ukraine that helped to get us into this mess. Outside forces, shall we say, cultivated that hate and weaponized it, actually, sadly, against the people of Ukraine. And I know that your area of expertise is Russia and Ukraine, and particularly history. So let me ask you this, something that we've discussed. And how will the ultranationalists, those who have a propensity to use violence, how in the world what part will they play? I'll add one other thing. I interviewed Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky, and when I talked about post-war Ukraine, that's the issue that he brought up. How do you maintain any agreements with such a violent group in the mix? Dr. Petro.
It's very difficult. And I think if Ukraine is to survive as a country and to thrive as a democracy, it has to be able to assert the rule of law within its own country. And these far-right groups have their aggressive attitudes, not just toward Russia, which is perhaps even understandable in the context of war, but they have been inciting hatred toward the other Ukrainians and other government officials consistently over the last 20 years. And the government has been reluctant to deal with this. But no democracy can survive this kind of internal conflict that is being fomented by what is now a very well-organized and militarized group. There are 2 brigades of the Azov battalion alone fighting within the Ukrainian armed forces. And what happens after the war? Well, if there is a ceasefire, it's not at all clear that those guns will not be turned against those in the government that they might consider traitors for having signed a peace deal.
I think you're right. I have a friend who is Ukrainian who said he is convinced that he has family members who are Banderites, and that he's convinced that there will be some level of civil war post-war. So let me ask you this. The Trump administration seems all out right now. It's clear if you listen to Donald Trump's rhetoric that he wants to end this. What do you think is the, there are people saying, well, he wants to end it for this reason. Oh, he wants economic, alliances with Russia. What do you think, how sincere is the Trump administration and wanting to resolve the conflict? And what do you think that sincerity is based on?
Yeah, that's a question I've been asked by Russian analysts as well. And I think the answer is simply that Trump sees an end to the conflict as being in America's interest, first and foremost. And he's not burdened by an ideological perception of the absolute good or some sort of liberal global ideology. He simply wants what is best in the best interest of the United States. And he believes that other countries pursuing their own best interests, you can negotiate with them on that basis. And he seems to believe, honestly, that President Putin wants an end to this war as well. It's less clear to him that President Zelensky seeks an end to this war. And, that's based on the intelligence that he now has access to. So we will have to see. But so far, the lines of communication between the United States and Russia are open. With Ukraine, it's a little more difficult. And with Europe, it's not clear where Europe is heading right now and whether they have the stomach for peace.
Well, one of the things recently, I believe his name is Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, was in Washington meeting with President Trump. And what was surprising to many is that when he left, he said, well, I'm paraphrasing, of course, when this thing is over, I think that the European countries and all the Western countries are going to have to, quote, normalize relations with Russia. He didn't say come make friends. He said normalize. That implies dropping all sanctions. That implies returning to, economic alliances, et cetera, whether that'll happen or not. But I felt like, here's the way I felt. No. He met with President Trump and he got his arm twisted. But how important is it that the head of NATO said that? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll disagree with your assessment of what he meant by normalize. I think what Rutte meant by normalize relations is go back to the Cold War. That's what he meant by normalize relations. He meant build up our defenses, act tough on human rights, go back to the status quo before 1991 and viewing Russia as an enemy. Then we in NATO will be delighted. We'll have everything we need, and Europe will be divided the way it was, the way God intended, I guess, I would think he would say.
Very interesting. And the when it comes to here's my question, and I think this is going to be the issue. The issue of guns is one thing, of guns firing at each other and artillery firing at each other is one thing. But at the quote conclusion of this conflict, we get back to the cultural issues that have been going on for so long in Ukraine. The anger and hatred. If you have a vote and it doesn't go the way the ultranationalists or the West wants it, you're going to have West Ukraine versus what's left of East Ukraine. You're going to have so many internal problems. Can an external force, can the U.S., yes, the government of Kiev that we're funding, we can tell them what to do and they probably got to do it to some extent. But once that all melts away, can an external force resolve the contradictions in Ukraine that have been brewing for God knows centuries?
Colonial oversight only appears to work. It never works in the long run. The British have learned that. The French have learned that. The Dutch have learned that. It's time for Americans to learn that as well. I think. Colonial oversight, you can fund, you can put troops on the ground, you can place and replace puppet heads of government with people that you want in their place. But the problem with all of this is that people escape into their local communities in all of these empires and build a tougher cultural, political resistance to the occupying force. And in the case of Ukraine, there's been talk for, again, more than a decade of external administration. And they mean the external administration of the United States, which has extensive control in many government institutions, and by placing its officials in Ukrainian government institutions, in the court system, in the entire anti-corruption system, which is essentially run under a United States and Western veto, which essentially means that the flow of money within Ukraine, most of which is now being provided for even current accounts by the West, is controlled on a very essential daily level in Ukrainian politics. It tells people within Ukraine who has access to fund, who has political influence, and who does not. And all of that, however, can only last so long, but it doesn't actually change the attitudes of people, because a change of attitude has to come from within. And this is one of the things that has been, that was revealed to me, at least in my study of tragedy, is that you need that kind of internal catharsis to see your enemy in a different light if they're ever going to become anything other than your enemy.
Wow. So the other part I have to ask you is this, and that is the economic part. And here's what I mean. We had Dr. Jack Rasmus on earlier, and one of the things he talked about was, for lack of a better word, the infiltration of Western capital and Western capital sources into Ukraine. That all throughout Ukraine, there are people that have bought up stuff. They've bought up the industries. They see Ukraine as an investment. They see it as a place to, let's be frank, to extract wealth. Mm-hmm. Certainly, when the conflict is over, these colonial power related, the capitalists, the big money people, are not going to be thrilled about walking away. You know, BlackRock bought up half of the farmland. They want their money back. How does that dynamic affect your ability, negatively or positively? I think that answer is pretty obvious, to resolve things after the conflict.
I think that the economic component of what I would have called colonial rule in Ukraine by the West is an important one, but I think there's a tendency among capitalists to deceive themselves as to what they can extract. And it really surprises me, because there have been boom periods of Western investment in Ukraine and bust periods. I guess I can only come back to the saying that is commonly attributed, I think, to Dale Carnegie. There's a sucker born every minute in the West who thinks, oh, I can get into Ukraine cheap now, and once I'm there, I'll build up something and be able to extract resources and then get out before any of this is, these assets of mine are sequestered. But every generation seems to not learn the bitter lesson that there is no reliable constituency for the rule of law in Ukraine. And this is not just because the Western oligarchs come in and want to make a quick profit. The problem is that pool is already infested with sharks that they're trying to get into. And the sharks are the Ukrainian oligarchs themselves and the Russian oligarchs before them. There's two sets of oligarchs already playing in those waters before the West even gets to tip its toe in. So I think they're fooling themselves on what they're going to, what sort of profits they're likely to make after the conflict is resolved in Ukraine. This current conflict is resolved in Ukraine.
Lastly, briefly, the conflict within the Trump administration. I look at Rubio, I look at there's the blob still pushing Trump. Is there any level of ideological or unanimity? Is there any or unified approach? How much of a problem is that for the Trump administration?
Well, I think every administration has its differences, and people who come there as heads of major organizations to head the foreign policy section, to head the military, these are people with their own ideas. They weren't born yesterday. So there's bound to be some sort of conflict. But so far, at least, Trump has clearly shown that he's the top dog and can make the rest of his cabinet heel. He reminds me more in that sense of a personality like Abraham Lincoln during the war, when he asked if people in the cabinet agreed with him, and they didn't, and he said, "Well, the ayes have it, because this is not a democracy." They're there to do the president's bidding and to serve the president. And as long as the president gives them clear and direct marching orders, such as accomplish this, sign this deal, let's make this negotiation happen, and not abstract fantasies about how the world might be a better place 15 or 20 years from now if we all wanted good things for each other. As long as those marching orders are clear, I think the impact of U.S. foreign policy will be greater under President Trump than under his predecessor.